I was tapering people on a long-term basis. And so the great philosopher Goldilocks, you might recall, she didn't want something too hot, too cold, something too hot, too soft. So there's the kind of 3 to 5 to 7 to 10 day detoxes, which are too fast, possibly, for people in the throes of narcotic withdrawal, and they wind up bouncing back to their previous use. And this forever plan of putting people on, maintenance for methadone and or Suboxone, I think are too long. And so there were lectures at the time in order to get this little prefix for your DEA license. So there was an X you had to have there to do Suboxone, and you could only have 30 people in your roster total at any given moment. And again, I wound up lecturing for them because they liked my model. And there was no real problem with it, and of picking people over a period of about 4 months to taper. So it's not the too long, of years or forever, and it's not the too short of a week or something like that to detox people. And I came up with that model over time a little bit, but it's basically patterned on the concept of grief. That when you have a loved one die, it takes you about 3.5, 4 months before you can kind of see the world again without the veil of tears.
Hello, Culminators. Happy spring. I'm here with my friend, Dr. Randall Bock. He is an interesting guy, an intellectual. Bought me a kosher quasi cheeseburger last year in a case that ended up not being a case, but it was great to see him in person. Randy's had me on his show. Randy's got his own show, and he's on X, and it just makes me realize I never ask people where do you find the couple things I don't do. I don't say like and subscribe, and I don't say where can people find you. But I guess I'm just that explains why nobody watches or listens. Randy Bock, welcome to ColemanNation. I want people to hear about a topic that you and I have been talking about for many years, and which you know all too well based on your personal experience, which is the abuse of the medical licensing system for political ends and financial ones as well. How you doing, Randy?
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Let me first, you're welcome. Let me first ask, tell the folks about your background. I know it, but I'm not going to. I don't want to just read off.
Yeah, fair enough.
You had a very successful practice in addiction, and that's kind of how we get into this. But
fair
tell
enough.
the story.
So, so people can find me. No, I'm just joking, but I have a Substack, which is if they Google my name, you can and find me on Substack. I have a piece called Breaking Bad Medicine, which is a pun in two ways. I mean, it's based on Breaking Bad, the show. So it's Breaking Bad Medicine because it talks about some of the vagaries and vicissitudes and vituperations within my own career, how I wound up where I was, which is kind of an unusual path, and I'll get to that in a second. But the second way to read that is Breaking Bad Medicine. And that cuts both ways. So it's a pun. That's how I roll, man. And I wound up in the crosshairs of the medical board. I was a general practice doctor. I was doing kind of the English model of general practice, doing outpatient medicine only for about almost 30 years in a blue collar suburb of Boston called Revere, named after Paul, who was actually Paul Revoir, his I think grandfather, French Canadian. So yeah, so whenever I show up at work, it could have been au revoir, mes amis, or mon enfant. Anyway, I don't think Paul Revere ever showed up in Revere, which was North Chelsea, until it separated. Anyway, so I just did kind of regular storefront Marcus Welby kind of medicine, sore throats, colds, broken bones, disability exams, whatever people had that came in off the street. So it was a kind of a walk-in clinic. We see some of these things like urgent care places out and about now. And I was fairly happy doing that. Over the years, as a solo guy, I morphed, or I I kind of added on different aspects of practice because it was expedient, and my kids insisted on eating, and so did my wife, and all that kind of exigencies of life that we encounter. And so, like for instance, when Viagra came out, I thought, kind of like Jimmy Carter's biography, "Why Not the Best?" Um, he wrote that as an autobiography. I think he had the wrong person, but anyway. Or like quoting Hillel, if not me, who, if not now, when. And so I started doing Viagra. People were happy
Really,
about it.
a perfect phrase, a perfect um, Talmudic expression when we're talking about
Yeah.
ED.
Yeah, it's kind of funny the way Jimmy Carter kind of, changed that a little bit to "Why Not the Best?" Uh, and anyway, because I think there are some elements of that. So, when Viagra came out, I, did that, and people came from all, through the tri-state region, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, whatever, to come see me. I had some ads on the Howard Stern show. I didn't endorse Howard Stern, but he endorsed me apparently. So, it was a good thing. And I kind of speak Spanish pretty well. And so a lot of Latinos in the area had some Spanish ads for this and that. I had a Spanish clientele. When obesity medications came out, fen before it was taken away, I did some of that. Those are just kind of random forays into extra, work and so forth to keep myself busy and whatnot. So when the thing called Data 2000, which is the Drug Addiction Treatment Act of 2000, um, was passed, the idea was to destigmatize narcotic de-addiction. So getting people off drugs, people going to methadone clinics, and everyone's like, "Oh, those are bad places," because everyone's kind of, dopey and kind of drooling and dawdling and hanging out and whatnot, and indolent and whatnot. So they thought, and people all go to those places, and there's kind of a subculture or maybe a supra drug culture on top of it. Whatever people, passing methadone around, all that kind of stuff. So they thought, oh, well, we have this other stuff, buprenorphine, which, mind you, rhymes with morphine, which is a narcotic itself, but it's a little less dopey than methadone. I like to compare like methadone to molasses, and maybe buprenorphine more is like sugar or whatever. So it's a little bit less syrupy and long acting than
And
methadone.
what would heroin be in that analogy?
Yeah, heroin's. I guess maybe we would make buprenorphine more like maple syrup. Methadone, methyl molasses. Buprenorphine would be maple syrup, and then heroin would be sugar. So that the heroin's kind of a quicker hit. And so the idea was to put people on buprenorphine, which is a little less dopey than the methadone, and a little bit kind of blocking some of the highs you might get on heroin. So, just before we even get started on that, I like to point out that, kind of to quote Garrett Morrison, Saturday Night Live, baseball has been very, very good to me. In a sense, drug addiction treatment has been very, very good to the medical establishment and the growth of the ancillary addiction, psychiatry, psychology, social work complex. We don't, as a matter of fact, write prescriptions for vodka for people with whiskey problems. We don't write for, more benzodiazepines for people with, addiction to Klonopin or whatever. We don't write prescriptions for, call girls for Tiger Woods. We don't write prescriptions for Las Vegas for Jimmy the Greek, whatever. We don't treat the other addictions with hair of the dog. We expect you to sober up, get away from those things. But for some reason, this would be like a Dr. Evil puzzlement. Um, we as physicians get to prescribe exclusively opiates, including methadone, including Suboxone, and lo and behold, there's an industry where we keep people on those things rather than sober them up. So that's a side note to where we were, and so that it somewhat informs my mindset as we headed into the 2000s. I had been in practice in Revere since 1983 or so, and I had my own practice. Basically, I had storefront practice on a main street, and as time went on, I wound up owning the building around. So I basically had a turnkey operation, which I could have sold, at some point, whatever. So it was kind of my thing. I loved the place. And to varying extents, people liked or loved me. I don't want to sound like Sally Field, but I was one of my buddies called me the best veterinarian in Revere because that's the way guys compliment each other. Um, And he was joking, of course. Anyway, so um, that's what he kept saying. You're the best vet in Revere. So it was a good time. I saw people over multiple generations of their families' lives and whatnot, and so I was kind of the family doc for the area. Anyway, um, but when the buprenorphine came out, I actually wound up lecturing for Reckitt Benckiser because they thought my practice was a model for what Suboxone practices should be. I was tapering people on a long-term basis, and so the great philosopher Goldilocks, you might recall, she didn't want something too hot, too cold, something too hot, too soft. So there's the kind of 3 to 5 to 7 to 10 day detoxes, which are too fast, possibly, for people in the throes of narcotic withdrawal, and they wind up bouncing back to their previous use. And this forever plan of putting people on, maintenance for methadone and or Suboxone, I think are too long. And so there were lectures at the time in order to get this little prefix for your DEA license. It was an X you had to have there to do Suboxone, and you could only have 30 people in your roster total at any given moment. And again, I wound up lecturing for them because they liked my model. And there was no real problem with it, and of taking people over a period of about 4 months to taper. So it's not the too long, of years or forever, and it's not the too short of a week or something like that to detox people. And I came up with that model over time a little bit, but it's basically patterned on the concept of grief. That when you have a loved one die, it takes you about 3.5, 4 months before you can kind of see the world again without the veil of tears. And it worked out. And again, for the people who wanted to do it, there's an old joke about psychiatry. How many psychiatrists take to change a light bulb? It's only one, but the light bulb has to really,
Has to
really,
really
want
want
to
to
change.
change, right?
So to that, to that effect, in order to weed out or deter people who just wanted more drug, because a lot of people can't get the money for heroin or whatever that day, or buy illicit OxyContin, whatever. It's about $150 a day was the average of what people were coming in with a habit, which would probably be like $200 a day now. Um, they would, come in and say, "Oh, I want to go to detox," and they would get some Suboxone, whatever. They might sell that. They might take whatever. And it's all a matter of fungibility. They could take this and not to take that, or take that and not take this, whatever. And a lot of people were selling, and there became a secondary market for buprenorphine, just like there is a secondary market for methadone. That's a whole nother story. Anyway, in order to deter that, I had a barrier to entry of $185, which was kind of a fee that I charged across the board. And I spent an hour, it wasn't a medical visit, just to tell them what the program was.
Wait,
And
what was that number again?
$185.
So already the doctors are hating you because that's such an insignificant number.
I mean, people pretty much, it was a day's worth of their heroin habit for the most part. So if they were going to get some, whatever, most people had no problem finding that. And if they couldn't find it, we would, I mean, we didn't want to advertise it, but we defer or ignore that if people were solemn and interested in really doing the detox. And so that worked out. Somebody tattled over time because I was charging it to everybody. I didn't discriminate one way or another. And because it essentially violated, I mean, I had heard this, mind you, from a doctor who told me when I was training for buprenorphine stuff, a local doctor, family practice guy, he had told me that's what he did. So I didn't come up with the idea myself because I worried about having this flood. I had been known previously in the area as Dr. No, patterned after the James Bond villain, because I said no to everything. I had this system where people come in with their back pain, whatever, and it was pretty easy. I had a kind of a formula to determine who was lying about back pain. They were always allergic to the low-level narcotics. They wanted the high-level narcotics. They had been coming from other towns. I would call up a few pharmacies. It was pretty easy, and I would try to get people to drug treatment, that kind of thing. But I was a tough nut to crack for them. And the word on the street, I heard this from many people, that I was Dr. No. And people would come to me as a challenge to see if they could score drugs off me. Anyway, so that was kind of my mindset about the thing, that I didn't want to just be another, drug pusher and whatnot, because people already had that in a lot of places. There are a lot of pill mills and whatnot. And I wanted to bring some clarity to it. And I had wound up doing kind of, I told this to my friend, and he had said, "Oh, charge, this barrier." He said, "I charge $185 or whatever, something like that." So I started doing that. It turns out I should have researched it further. I should have talked with somebody in your profession. in advance. Anyway, a few years down the line, Mass Health came to me. They said, "Oh, you shouldn't have been doing that. You can't ever charge anybody anything." And so I gave up. I refunded $51,000, something like that, which I had collected over those years to the individuals and so forth. And that was that. And so forth. They dropped everything, and it was no big deal. But I apparently was on the radar. And what happened, because I took down the skin in the game, the barrier to entry, I wound up getting not just my original core competency people who wanted to detox, but I got all the other people as well, kind of the harder core, more people who are just shuttling in and out and doing polypharmacy and just getting drug from place to place. And so it became a little bit tougher nut, and I wound up getting more of the kind of tougher element, more criminal and whatnot. So I've seen my share during the course of this time thereafter, after the first couple of years of doing this, murderers and big time drug deals and whatnot. Kind of a rough crowd. And I had a system, getting back to baseball, where I basically had 3 or 4 strikes and you're out. And so I had a system where people had to be drug free. I was giving them basically a narcotic, and they had to, abjure from, eschew other narcotics and all that kind of stuff. And even if they didn't understand those words, I tell them not to do it. So, and they had to show up for their appointments and things. Again, if you wanted to do it, was not that hard a system. It's kind of like getting out of the well. Somebody throws you a ladder, and then you climb out or you don't. Or you want to dawdle, whatever. You don't really want to climb out. And so, so that became a different kind of practice, and I wound up getting a complaint a year or so. And so these people
from patients.
Yeah, it was. I mean, again, the difference between my practice and the other ones, because at the time you could only have 30 people assigned to your name and your little DEA prefix. I had people. See, the comparison I use is like a city bus, and most other practices were like a 747, transcontinental flight. They would take a certain number of people in. They did the other side of Goldilocks. They did the maintenance model. They took the methadone model. And they said, "Oh, methadone clinics were bad because they kept people on forever, and we're going to put them on buprenorphine, and we're going to keep people on forever." This became a very convenient way. It's a much, much easier way to practice as a physician. You get the same 30 people, you get the same money, you get them coming in regularly, and you just give them their communion wafer, basically of Suboxone, and it becomes kind of the church of Suboxone, and they, pay their tithing to you. And whatever, everyone seems to be happy because patients actually don't want to be challenged. A lot of them, they just want to keep their drug, and they want to be told the convenient lie that they have a disease in a sense, and this is like the treatment for diabetes. I was in my car, it's a Tesla, and it has grok on it. So I was not in the mood for radio or podcast, and I started to query grok about alcohol and detox and whatnot, because I was interviewing somebody who had this issue and whatnot, and I wanted to kind of see what the thoughts are, and I gave up that example about alcohol, not getting maintenance alcohol, and narcotics getting it, and all the formulations were what Mrs. Grok, it's a woman's voice in the car, she said, "Well, you're making a false distinction, because narcotic addiction is a disease like diabetes. If you take away their insulin, they will die." This is just totally not true. Point of fact, if you detox somebody from alcohol, which we do routinely, that is a far more dangerous thing, with delirium tremens and all kinds of, potential seizures and whatnot, far more dangerous than taking people off narcotics. And, it's done historically in the prison system, although now they're putting people on Suboxone. But historically in the prison system, people get arrested, and they have drug habits, they wind up in jail, they have a tough week, and they feel like they have the flu. It's not fun. I get it. They have diarrhea. They're throwing up. It's, again, a lot like the flu. They're going through withdrawal. But if you come back in 2 weeks later, the example I use is Joe and Fred get caught up by, what is that movie in Turkey where they go to prison? I forget the name of it. Anyway.
Midnight Express.
Thank you. So if Joe and Fred, one's a heroin addict, he's shooting up $200 a day, heroin, and the other guy's type 1 diabetic, and he's shooting up, I don't know what's X, number 80 units of insulin every day, and you take the Turkish guards are like, needles, they get rid of all the needles indiscriminately. So Joe and Fred are in the room, and neither one has needles. Well, Fred the diabetic is dead, ostensibly in a week or two. He goes through insulin withdrawal, but it's not really. He dies from his disease because he doesn't have replacement insulin. Whereas the heroin guy is sick initially than the diabetic. But 2 weeks later, he's lifting weights. He feels great about himself and so forth. So, my idea was to get people to the default position of not being on drugs. It's not that hard.
So you let me make this clear. You, as a physician, are rejecting the disease model of addiction.
Yeah, I mean, there is a word for it. Andrew Clavin, who's, a novelist, but a sage in a way, and possibly a saint, he's a very interesting man. He's written on this, and he says, there already is a word for addiction. It's called addiction. You know, there's a word for it. That's what it is. It's an addiction. We understand that we are addictable people. There times in my life I had to go out running. I felt miserable if I didn't go out running every day. And we fall in love. Love is an addiction in a sense. And people talk about the brain changes from narcotic addiction. Well, literally, we have the same kind of brain change. They're not really changes. They're kind of like, the different. It's kind of like your home.
Adaptations.
Yeah, I mean, if you had an infrared picture of your home, during holidays, you'd say, "Oh my God, this part of your house is all lit up, the kitchen and the dining room, whatever. There's some weird activity. Your house is going through neurologic changes." And then you take you're on vacation someplace, you go to Aruba, whatever. They do the infrared of your house, like, "Oh my God, there's no activity. He's dead." It's like, no, the house is still there. The house is not dead. You have different parts of activity in your house at different times based on different exigencies. And so those brain changes people talk about are different parts lighting up. So you have a holiday, your kitchen's lit up, your kids' your basements light up, whatever. There's different parts of your brain. When you go through love and then anti-love, if somebody breaks up with you, divorce or whatever, you go through misery. So we have this kind of standard pattern of ups and downs, whatever, all through our life. It's called life.
Right. Okay. All right. I
So
just
that
wanted to get that because I think that's something that, we are, except in the realm of politics, we've become a very non-judgmental society. In the realm of politics, of course, everyone is worthy of the guillotine if they don't agree with us. But I wanted to take I didn't want us to blow past that. I hope I didn't
No, that's fine.
take you too
My
far
my
off your.
my position, if go into the time machine of Google Scholar or any of these lenses where you can go back to pre-1995, say, my view is the view. That is the predominant view, not Whoopi Goldberg's the view, but the view of medicine that these things were not diseases. What changed, I believe, again, this is my conspiratorial tone, is that this came along a concept called mental health parity, parity, and not it's almost a parody of medicine in a sense, but it's mental health parity, the equal uh, sign. And this comes along with similar concepts such as harm reduction and whatnot. But the concept of mental health parity is that your insurances, health insurances, need to cover your brain the way it would cover a sprain. There are things that we can find pathologically and forensically. God forbid, one of us gets a glioblastoma. It is a cell type. We can recognize it. We can see it on an MRI. We can do tissue biopsy. We extract the thing. You don't have a glioblastoma anymore, or you die from it, whatever. But when you die from it, you die from a glioblastoma. It's a very identifiable thing. And loads of illnesses that are hugely identifiable, whether it's sickle cell anemia, diabetes, all the kinds of things. Those are tissue diagnoses. You can find blood tests for them. But when mental health parity came along, they said, well, it's so sad that somebody has depression and doesn't get the same insurance coverage that if he broke his leg. What's up with that? Well, okay, I mean, it sounds great. And there are certainly severe, psychiatric problems like schizophrenia, which, need to be covered one way or another. But what happened is that opened the door because the same people who are making the diagnosis and the same people getting paid are determining the parameters of what those things are. So they become the recipients and the gatekeepers, and they turn the thing on. And so it becomes a little bit like, the historic, monkeys in the maze with the, little cocaine mill, whatever. They keep pressing the lever. And so what we've seen since the mental health parity, and I've written on this topic for Brownstone and for my Substack and whatnot, and it should be, frankly, I came upon it, I was like jaw drop because nobody's written on this topic. And it's a huge, it's like a big mound under the rug. It's like, what is that? Nobody, it's all brushed under. Nobody talks about it. Nobody talks about repealing it or changing it. And again, for severe issues and whatnot, but since this thing came along as a concept, term of art in the 90s, the number of mental health issues have just grown enormously. What I have with the four A's, there's addiction, alcohol, excuse me, addiction, which is clearly alcoholism, but addiction, ADD, autism, and anxiety, for instance, just for four. I mean, you can make a few other A's. Now we have sexual dysmorphia, which is an A, in a sense, autogynephilia, if you want to, use my alliteration. But, we've had a massive growth in all of these diagnoses. At the same time, everyone's getting paid for them, and we're forced to be paying. And so, on a per person basis, we spend about $1,500 per person more in real dollars for our insurance because we've had this parity thing come along. And are we better off for it? That's a whole separate question. You're talking about all the kind of libertine aspects and everything but policies. We, accept everything. We accept homelessness. Everything has gotten more of it. We have more divorce, more homelessness, more all the other things I mentioned, in the same time. It's not, causation. It's collinear. We can't prove it. But, my suspicion is once we let people, determine what those things are for which they get paid, they find more of it.
Now we're talking about the framework for your approach to treating addiction. Now, speaking of gatekeepers, what happened next?
Well, hilarity ensued, as they say. I just didn't really, I didn't realize I was roadkill. There's the perils of Pauline, Dudley Do-Right or whatever, always managed to rescue her as she's in the sawmill, strapped to a log or whatever, and cut her off. And every movie you ever watch, they always have the bomb. They have the thing, it's ticking down, da, 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 and they, whether you're watching 24 or whatever, they always manage to undo the thing, and everyone's whew. Anyway, that I just didn't realize it was a train coming at me. So I would get these complaints, like, again, one a year, one every 9 months or something like that. And mostly they were people who were, angry that I had not fulfilled their immediate need for drug, even though they had kind of been failing the program and that kind of stuff. And so, the reason I brought up the city bus and the 747 is that I had a higher flux, as we say in physics. Basically, I had a higher, actually the unit they use is a psi, like in psychiatry. In physics for flux. So I had more people come through my program because people would come in, they try it, not everyone succeeded. I would give them a closeout period. They could come back a few months later. And I was churning people rather than keeping a stable of 30 people. I was doing the Herculean task of kind of cleaning out these stables in a sense and trying to get people to a different place. And so I was trying to do transformative care rather than maintenance care. And because of that, over the course of my 8 years doing this, I had about 1,500 different startups of people on buprenorphine, and 1,500 different people, 2,000 startups. And so I was seeing about 150, 200 people per year going through my program, whereas the other doctors had 30 people. They were giving me everything they wanted. Obviously, there can be no complaints, and they only had 30 of them, and everyone's happy because the narcotic addicts are getting a narcotic. And the doctors are not challenging them. So everything's copacetic. It's all, everyone's happy.
Well, all right. So can I be the one to say it? The doctors are getting something else also.
Right. They're getting, yes, they're getting fed in their own way. And everyone, they're in a little happy triangle of a pharmaceutical company, physician practice, whatever, and patient. And outside of this little triangle is the taxpayer one. I'm going to leave that aside because somebody else is paying for this system where they're, in this little homeostasis. But so in my case, my point is that I had a higher number of people coming through me. I mean, even the Marriott, you can go to the nicest hotel. If they have 1,000 guests a year or some higher number, they're going to have 0.1% of them complain. And that's a significant number. If you just look at negative reviews, the negative reviews is everything. Like I said, I drive a Tesla. A lot of people, when people are mad at Elon Musk, all the negative reviews of Teslas go up. People had a reason at various times to be angry with me because I might have taken one of them themselves or their loved one away from my program. And, I just thought people had to have agency about what they wanted to do. I told them they could go to meth, and I wasn't the only shop in town. If they wanted to go on maintenance, they could go to anybody else prescribing this except me. But people were like, sad, mad, and not glad about not, coming to see me. So I couldn't keep everybody happy. And when these complaints came in, I just, simply wrote a response to them, and they went away. So there was a series of them, like, I don't know, like a few, like three or four or five of them, whatever, and they all went away. But and then one of them came along that I didn't realize was this, truck, or, something that blindsided me, and it was a complaint. I can come up for air, or I can talk about the complaint.
If you want to, I mean, everything you're saying, of course, I'm familiar with the story, but I frankly think if now that I've given you a chance to take some breath, go for it.
All
Tell
right.
the story.
So very briefly, the absurdity is this guy, no, he's no longer with us. He died from heroin overdose addiction, from what I understand, because from reading the, obit and whatnot. So it's a sadness. So he was 10 years younger than me, 6'3". I'm 6 feet, but he was 6'3" and hefty. So he was a big guy. Anybody would challenge. All right. And he had been a worker at General Electric, and had taken a hiatus from his job from a back surgery. And then he never went back, no pun intended, because he was collecting disability. And he wound up getting on drugs, doing heroin, selling heroin. He was fixing fences, not mending them, but fixing fences for people, and maintaining a couple homes, one for his mom, etc. So he was a busy enough guy, and he was not physically disabled anymore. But he'd been a few years into this, and he came to me for detox. And, I told him, I said, look, I can detox you. I can get you from that drug, heroin, and put you on this drug, Suboxone. That's not an issue. And we can do that for some length of time, and maybe drop your dose and whatnot. But I kind of feel like if you want to stay away from drugs, you have to be satisfied with yourself. And I think from what you're saying, and you had to have been there, as I say, from what you're saying, you are, in a sense, gaming the system, and you're collecting the disability check when you can do all these things. You can sell heroin, you can work on fences, you can fix your mom's house, all that kind of stuff, and get enough extra profit to buy your own heroin, all that kind of stuff. What at some point, what you need to do is come whole, and see if you can get back to your real work, and get a productive check for honest work. And then you'll feel honest about yourself. You'll cleanse yourself in a way. And it's not, baptism, whatever. It's not religious experience, but in order to feel good about yourself, you look in the mirror in the morning, and you see somebody you like, and you don't need drugs, So I can do the pharmaceutical part, but the other part is some kind of emotional, spiritual growth thing, whatever you want to call it. And that's a you thing, And so, he said, you just want to take away my disability, whatever. I'm like, look, dude, that's not my job. I don't do that. This is private. This is like a lawyer-client thing. I'm not discussing you, whatever. I'm talking to you for you. That's it. That's as far as it goes. Anyway, he had some lab tests where, and I was juggling between rooms, and I'm walking in the hallway. He calls me back in, and he says, "Doctor," and he's weeping. It's kind of, it's a big guy like that weep, and he's kind of holding it back a little bit. He says, "Doc, I got to talk to you." So I come in, I shut the door. He's like, "What is it?" He says, "You were right." I said, "I'm always right." That's not an issue, but right about what? What am I right about? He says, "Well," he says, and I swear to God, he says, "I'm lazy." He says, "You're right. I'm lazy. I'm doing this. I'm lazy. I'm too lazy to get out of this." I said, "You know what? You're not. You might be half right. You notice it, and noticing it shows that there's a pathway out. And this is how you get out. And we're not going to do it today. We don't have to do anything now, etc. But I applaud you for noticing it. And we can go from there." Anyway, he never showed up again. He was supposed to show up for his kind of, we get people off the one drug. We have to kind of, it's like a transition that we monitor over the course of 8 hours, the transition between the one drug and the other drug. He never showed up for that thing. I never saw him again. And 3 or 4 months later, apparently wrote this letter, a screed kind of thing. And he's an overweight guy, and I kind of touched him in the belly and pointed like Pillsbury Doughboy, we got to work on this. And I touched his glasses. I said, "You have to be smarter." I mean, I didn't do them all simultaneously, but you got to be smarter about yourself. I was kind of a hands-on guy. I wasn't handsy, but I'm demonstrative. And
Yeah.
and mind you, at the time there were 6 or 7 other people in the office, my staff, other patients, whatnot, and nothing ever happened. Nobody heard anything. He had come and gone like ephemera, and like a cloud. Nobody had seen whatever. Nobody really remembered it. But 3 or 4 months later, he comes up with the letter he sends to the board, not to me. He sends to the board that I had punched him in the stomach. I'd thrown his glass on the ground. I'd called his wife a rude name. If I had done any of those things, and he's 6'3" and I'm not, I would have been mush. I mean, plus that he would have yelled. Nothing happened. It's like the Sherlock Holmes Silver Blaze, the dog that didn't bark in the night. Holmes' evidence is that something didn't happen. The board never processed this. I'm a guy who stops almost at yellow lights. I got no criminal history, nothing. I don't do the drugs. I don't do any of that stuff. I have my handcuff and pretty much live pretty straight, and that's that. And kind of a he said thing. They went with the narcotic addict. So I wound up in front of the it's kind of like a DA. I wanted it's called complaint counsel at the board. Fortunately, I brought my own attorney, and they read this letter to me. And I also swear that they read the letter to me, and I took it in my hand. I read the thing. I was like, oh my word. I'm like, this doctor should not be in practice. Whoever did this should not be doing medicine. And so the guy was like thrilled. He's like, oh, so you're resigning? I'm like, oh no, not me. That's imaginary. That wasn't me. That's imaginary. If a doctor did that, the doctor shouldn't be. But this never occurred. And I kind of explained to him, anyway, they never dropped this thing. And I think I became a convenient target. I'm a registered Republican. You can go to Open Secrets and all that kind of stuff, see my donations and whatnot. Apparently I don't see color, but apparently people say I'm not a person of color. Um, and I don't fit into any of the kind of victim preferred categories affirmatively one way or another. And I think I was a very reasonable target for this kind of action. And along the way, I was working on a book, which I have to get published any day now. I mean, I have it pretty much rewritten, but I was working at the time because my experience of doing the narcotic detox, from hearing what people were saying from the other clinics about they had a disease, they couldn't ever stop and all that kind of stuff. They were being infantilized and kind of what I call zoo kept. They were kind of in methadone. You're kind of kept in the zoo. They don't want you to be a free range animal or whatever. They want to be able to control you and have you and make money off you. At the same sense, you still get fed and whatnot. Your drug whatnot. And the experience I had heard had formulated a book that I was writing called, and it's still called, Withdraw to Freedom. Getting out of the narcotic addiction maze. And I sent the book was in galley. It's in galley still, but I sent a copy to the board so they could understand who I am, and I'm a serious actor, and whatever. And when they saw that I wrote in the first 2-3 chapters that addiction is not a disease, that became the centerpiece of their ultimate complaint for suspension against me, which did pass. I have no idea why, but in 2014 it passed the board 8-0. And this gets to the point about what the boards are and how they operate and so forth. And so I was in the wilderness, a total of 6 years. I got my license back once, and then they promptly took it away, which was an absurd thing. I'm not going to get into that unless we have to. But they went after me hook and nail. And there's evidence which I have from a closed door session. I have no idea how it showed up my desk because all the other ones I gotten from the open door sessions, but I got one that they shouldn't have sent me from their closed door deliberations where they said Bock was always guilty, and they had to keep me off the streets somehow from practicing, and they were going to do anything they could, and that was the centerpiece, in a sense, of our mercurial or quixotic claim, almost to the Supreme Court to get the board to accountability. But they had this in their idea because I didn't see addiction as a disease. I was, shouldn't be there. And the question, a cynical question would be whether I was a threat to the marketplace of, the methadone / Suboxone industrial complex.
Which, as you taught me and gave me the opportunity to work with you on the case, the Supreme Court has ruled that when the people who are doing the regulating, whether or not they are clothed with the mantle of the state or not. I might have said whether or not. There might be an extra or not in there. The meaning is still the same. When they are market participants themselves, in other words, when your medical review board is made up of doctors who are in competition with you, that deserves an extra look. To which the First Circuit Court of Appeals said when you tried to sue them for their conduct, nah, whatever. The worst circuit court in the country, by the way, the Ninth Circuit, actually gets it right now 50% of the time. But the first is the worst.
Yeah, it's a sadness. I had,
Well, let's tell us the happy ending, at least in terms of your license.
fair enough.
You ended up fighting the suspension, twice. Second time was not as long of
No.
a haul.
Yeah, no, they kept me out. And mind you, they had ruled against me on the wrong standard of evidence to begin with. And this bespeaks an arrogant, errant board, a runaway board of medicine, which was proudly so. I don't know what it has to do with the name Candace, but I think being, I don't know. I've heard there's somebody named Candace out now who goes around kind of on a rampage. But at the time, our local Candace is Candace Lapidus Sloan, and she's the daughter of physicians, I believe, or a physician. And she grew up well. She married, I think it's okay, Barry Sloan, who is the son of Marshall Sloan, who runs Century Bank, which is big regional bank. And she's in the society pages when they existed, hanging out with Deval Patrick and Dukakis and went on, goes to all the big functions, so forth. But she's very wealthy, and when she's not driving her Maybach, she's driving her Bentley.
Really?
Oh,
That's big
well, from
time.
my assessment, I've seen her drive up to the board. So she was the chairperson of the Board of Registration of Medicine for far too long, literally and legally. You're supposed to have a 2-year term. You could take a hiatus and come back for 2 years, and that's that. She, for some reason, was allowed to be the chair of the board for a solid decade, from 2011 on. And then she is no longer there. We've got a new one and so forth. And everybody since then, goes through by the rules. So when during her reign, and it's not me, this is Chris Olson at the Mass Lawyers Weekly, somewhat contemporaneous with my diaspora or hiatus from medicine from 2014 essentially to 2020. He wrote an article saying that there was, no pun intended, mass overreach by the Mass Board of Registration of Medicine. And he just looked at the numbers there, where he had a set of 14 cases that had gone to DALA, which is basically kind of the appeals division of the administrative state in Massachusetts. So it's kind of like, it's not a real court, but it's like an appeals court. And so of 14 cases that had gone to DALA, I think 11 or 12 had been overturned. And this was totally contrary to what had been the prevailing wisdom or set of circumstances pre-Candace. And so what's up with that? You could go to the source. There was an article in Boston Magazine, and Candace Lapidus Sloan herself, basically saw it as her mission to go after doctors. She said for far too long, kind of a Liz Warren attitude in a sense, for far too long, evil bankers and whatnot for Liz Warren, evil doctors for Candace. She's the daughter of a doctor. She's a physician herself. She does derm. I don't know how much of it she does. But there's something in her craw that is against doctors and for the common good and whatnot. Which I mean, you could argue, well, okay, if there were fire there, whatever, but the data weren't there, and she did this kind of mass changeover in the number of suspensions that get thrown at physicians, and it winds up a little bit like the French Revolution. It's not to say that Robespierre and Marat, whatever his name was,
Todd.
didn't have some complaints about the monarchy. Okay. It's not to say that the Sun King was a Sun King, whatever. And it's not to say there weren't some injustices. But what happens is that you can go overboard. I think Chesterton said, the he said it better than I'm going to say it. But basically, a lot of people who can know what's wrong about what's current are wrong about how to fix it. Now, he said it much better than that. But a lot of people who can find complaints aren't necessarily better at adjudicating those future ones. And this is, a standard problem that it's easy to find something that's wrong. It's hard to redo it and do it better. And in Candace Lapidus Sloan's case, I don't think she did. And that's why a lot of these were overturned. But in the meanwhile, lives were ruined. My practice essentially disappeared. Like I said, I had a turnkey operation that was part of my nest egg, and that nest egg, my egg was crushed under her heel. So I had to fight the whole battle. You have to go on your own legal thing, and frankly, they hadn't had anybody fight to the extent that I did. And I was blessed by my other attorney, um, uh, who's retired now. But he had been my long-term friend, and there were some ups and downs. He was not part of the inner circle of the board attorneys. In order to fight these things, you basically have to have, you know, kind of somebody who's kind of got the, like the English barrister wig or whatever. Not quite, but have to kind of be in the inner circle. But even those
Well,
board,
this is especially true from what I understand in Boston and its environs. It is a very clubby bar.
yes, and you can club people with a bar, you can also bar people
They
with a
kind of did
club.
with you.
Yeah, and so at a certain point, I wound up getting that higher level attorney to do some of my other aspects of cleanup case and whatnot. But the reason I was able to carry on, again, for better or for worse, I think my attorney, Douglas Matthews, is a wonderful guy, but he missed a few things because he wasn't in the inner circle. So right from the get-go, they sued me in a sense under the wrong standard. Um, they had, I think, I can't remember the actual terms, but it's like you're supposed to sue them under the preponderance of the evidence, and they had something that was a lower standard, like a an inkling. I can't think of the right word, but they wound up in while I was out in between 2014 and 2018, while I was out, there was a similarly named guy, Sheldon Randall, who sued them in court because they had used this wrong evidentiary standard. The board is supposed to use the higher level standard. It's supposed to say, it's like the civil case, like with O.J. Simpson. If they thought there was a slight, I forget, the majority of the evidence, or whatever, then they can get him on the civil case. But it had to be a preponderance. It had to be something like in the range of 85, 90% likelihood that it was true. And they did me basically, just to make sure, kind of like it could be 50-50. He said, this guy said this. We're going to suspend him while we figure all that out. That's the way they did it. And that turned out to be the wrong standard. Now, my attorney didn't realize that because he wasn't in this inner group. And we could have probably had a faster overturning if we had known that. And the board, weirdly enough, I mean, fortunately, we're both sitting down. The board did not inform the people who were suspended on the wrong standard that they were suspended under the wrong standard. It seems to me like, if you have like Ford Motor Company, they put out the bad car and they say, oh my God, the catalyst converter is bad. We need a recall. I feel like as if they should have done a recall when they said, oh, this is the cohort of people we were suing and suspending under this falsely low, tripwire. We should call them back in, redo their cases because those cases seem to be, whatever the word is, like
A mistrial, yeah.
yeah, not miscarriage of justice, mistrial. It seems to me that my case, right from the get-go, would have been a mistrial if they convicted me on this really low standard where it's either likelihood or not, a likelihood of the evidence, as opposed to preponderance of the evidence. But they never called me back when, a couple of years later, that was found to have been the case for all of them. And so it was only a few years later that my attorney kind of filtered it out to him. I wound up getting a rehearing in 2018. And based on my original suspension, it was determined that none of it should have happened in the first place. All they accumulated a couple other complaints to go with that major one, and all those disappeared as not having any standard, whatever. They'd found two little tiny things because they'd done like a whole, audit slash, mental colonoscopy on my whole life. And they found two little things in my practice. They had signed one thing wrong on a form for my reapplication one year, and they didn't like the fact that I had been, when people didn't have their Suboxone, they lost their prescription, that I handed them a Suboxone and expected to get one back for the next guy. I had like a Good Samaritan tip jar with Suboxone that I kept under lock and key and whatnot. And they said I was, transferring narcotics. So they basically thought I was, whatever. So I had to pay $2,500 for each of those things. But other than that, I had my license back. Now, did they give me my life back? No. It's like the World Trade Center. It takes 2 seconds to knock it down, a decade, whatever, to build half of it, back again. And so that's the way things work. I did get my license back. They did, go after me tooth and nail. Like I said, I got my license back again fully in 2020, and I've been practicing since then. But, it's not the same. It's like, it's a
Of course.
scarlet letter in a sense. You have the suspension. Nobody really wants to hear about it. And weirdly enough, I got older in the meantime. My needs are different. So I'm working part-time, and it's nice. And I do a lot of other writing and, public health kind of criticism and analysis and whatnot. So it's been fruitful for me in other ways, but, it's not the road I chose right to begin with.
Randy, I thought people should hear this story, and now they have. I mean, you're a fascinating guy. You're a really thoughtful guy. That's precisely why you got into trouble. I mean, I don't have to tell you, most doctors are not intellectuals or particularly thoughtful people. Some are great, some are fantastic, and the best are the best. But what you went through, and the way the market is structured, and the incentives, just so many issues cross through this story. So I've known about it for years, and I haven't really been able to help you much with it because we had to. The road to that seems to go through the First Circuit, and we couldn't get the Supreme
Well,
Court's
yeah,
attention.
so I do, like the Academy Awards, I do want to give my thanks. Um, First of all, second of all to you, but I'm going to get to you in a second. But I want to thank, his name is almost unpronounceable. I call him Barani. He's got a really long name, Baranidharam Padmanabhan. And if you contact me, I can give you his name. But he's still out in the wilderness. He was suspended, and he is a brilliant man. And he's impecunious these days because he's fighting and fighting and fighting, kind of like Don Quixote. It's a very long struggle for him. I've told him he's an MD and a PhD. I've told him to, work on the PhD part and try to get some research jobs and whatnot. But he's been battling the board and the state and whatnot. And he's in a position where he can't kind of get back the way I did because he doesn't have any active cases. They've kind of ruled against him enough times. And he thinks it's kind of a rule of order. So, if any of your listeners are interested, I could try to connect you with him. But, I personally think he needs like a GoFundMe or whatever it is to kind of get back whatever. But a lot of his case, and so he wound up, being the inspiration for my case. And we did a Sherman Act case. I would not have thought of this on my own. And he found a new wrinkle to get at the medical boards. And it's I don't want to get into the details here. They can look at our case and whatnot, but there's a lot of interesting legal aspects. But he was the mind and brains, and we've had our ups and downs since then. He's fought kind of too long. I want him to get back to work, so we disagree about that. And things are touch and go. But my whatever I wound up getting my license back not because of that, but I think he was able to kind of fixate and point the lens at a lot of the malfeasances, and he had a lot more experience with other medical boards around the nation and whatnot. So I think this is a bigger issue. There are two physician women at Brownstone I met last fall who are taking this on as well. And I tried to connect them also. But there's an issue out and about where the medical boards are, I always get these words wrong, but meretricious or peremptory, whatever, but they are mean. They're big meanies. That's an easier way of phrasing it. And they have, again, counter to the, blind justice. My dad, he didn't really care about this, but on the Zodiac, he was a Libra. So we knew about Libras. But, the idea is that you're blinded to justice in front of every courthouse and so forth. But the Candace Lapidus Sloan aspect is that to presume guilt because the doctors are kind of privileged. They're educated and whatnot. It's kind of the Pol Pot version of justice. You get, speaking of eyeglasses, whatever, you get people because they have eyeglasses, they're intellectuals, and therefore they must have done something bad. That maybe not them personally, but their group, their class. And to have this kind of mindset in advance of hearing the cases is a social justice, which I always, state is neither social in the sense of being sociable, nor is it justice, obviously, because any adjective in front of justice dilutes it. And so that's my first, thank you and so forth is to Barani.
Who I've had the pleasure of meeting, and just, he's everything you say, I don't know him as well as you do, but he seems to be a real mensch, someone who has really been burned by this system that you've described here.
Yeah, so my second thank you, without getting too far away from this, is to you because you were willing to listen and carry forth this case, um, and in order to get to the Supreme Court, you need a major league hitter excuse me, a major league pitcher, and you've had victory at the major league at the Supreme Court in the Maytal case, whatever it's called,
Mattel, yeah.
2014 or something like that, whatever. And they listen to that. It's unfortunate, if I just wrote this case myself or I had, Doug Matthews, whatever, put his name on it, would not get heard. Ultimately, it didn't get heard anyway, but at least you gave us a fighting chance. And there's a very small number of cases that get heard by the Supreme Court, which here's frankly fewer cases than it used to as well. So there's a whole another issue about the Supreme Court and whatnot, and how they adjudicate and figure out which cases should be heard. This one should have been heard, and it's a sadness it wasn't. But
And let me point out to the legal people, you've got the first department really disregarding Supreme Court precedent here, and applying this case in a way that is inconsistent with the way other circuits have applied it, or rather, in other words, the Supreme Court's rule on market participants in regulatory bodies. So we had a real bona fide. It wasn't just merely the injustice, because that hardly ever motivates the Supreme Court. We had legitimate Supreme Court level reasons for them accepting cert, but wasn't happening. Randy, you're welcome. It was a pleasure to work with you, and it's a pleasure to know you and be your friend. And thank you for culminating with us today.
very much my honor.